Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner EU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers, airline partner SpiceJet.
I'm so happy to start this episode of Off the Cuff. You know what? We get a lot of famous people, a lot of powerful people, a lot of very smart people in many areas. But it's not often that we get two of them. So today we have two of them. We have Kanti Bajpai, a strategic scholar, one of the I would say oldest strategic scholars in India. He doesn't look it, but I think he's just published probably what is his 20th book, isn't it? Or 19th or 20th book, which is India and China, Why They Can't Be Friends. It's a wonderful book and a must read for anybody, not just in the strategic community, but anywhere, because we have a stake in this. Our children have a stake in this relationship, as would our grandchildren. With me also is Aadil Brar. Now, Aadil Brar at 28 is still not my youngest co-host yet. I think there's Sanya Dhingra who is younger than him, and maybe a couple more. Those are my colleagues. Aadil is also indirectly my colleague. He writes a column for The Print called Eye on China, weekly column, which he does in text and also in video. You must follow it. And why is he doing it? Because Aadil has dedicated his life and career to studying China that too few people do. He was a China journalist covering China for the BBC and an editor at the BBC World Service. And then he's been sitting in Toronto and watching China all the time. Please check out his Twitter handle. He obsessively watches China. And he puts out also the most interesting and important, but also the most entertaining stuff from China. Usually that comes from senior Chinese diplomats. So Aadil is going to be here. He is my co-host. He's not a guest. He is a co-host. He will, as I told him and Kanti, he will fill the domain knowledge gap here, because, it's no point just having an anchor trying to sound knowledgeable in areas where he may not be, as I am not in the area of China. So two of them, let me ask the first question, Kanti. Kanti, you lay out 4 reasons why India and China can't be friends. That is now all over. I've read it. We've all seen it. And the 4 reasons for our viewers, I will list here. One is that they have deep-seated misperceptions of each other, scars on our minds. Second, they have completely different ideas of their territorial parameters. The Chinese look back to their own imperial times. India looks back to the British times in terms of what India inherited from the British. Chinese don't accept that. And India obviously doesn't accept whatever happened under some dynasty in China, this or that. That is second. Third, that both are wary of each other's strategic partnerships. China's best friend is Pakistan. India is now part of the Quad. The best friend strategically is America. And 4, there is an asymmetry of power. Now, will you put these in a hierarchy of importance?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Shekhar, first of all, for doing this, and to Aadil as well. If I had to place my bets on those 4, I would say, as I think I have in some writings since the book came out, on the enormous disparity of power, which in comprehensive national power terms, is growing, led by, of course, the enormous gap in economic power. So if I had to, I would say the power gap is the biggest. And the second, which I put right at the beginning of the book, not at the end, is the enormous gap in perceptions. And gap is kind of a bland word for it, but increasingly the negative perceptions of each other, particularly I think on the Chinese side, from about the late 19th century onwards. I don't exculpate Indian perceptions of China. They exist as well, but that I think I would rank number 2. Of course, the border is vital. I call that the 3rd P, perimeters. And behind that is Tibet. So I think there's no gainsaying that that's a vital thing that's got stuck in our throats between the 2 countries. And probably last, actually, are partnerships. Sometimes India was with the Soviet Union against the Chinese. Sometimes it was with the Americans against the Chinese. Likewise, the Chinese were sometimes against, were with the Soviets against the Americans, and now with the Russians against the Americans. But the Chinese, I mean, we have always balanced against the Chinese by looking out either to the Americans or to the Soviets. The Chinese have looked to strategic partnerships against the other superpowers, that is, against either the Soviet Union or the Americans. But the long and short of it is that we've always been on different sides strategically, except, as I say, for very brief periods when there was kind of an entente between China and India against American hegemony, once during the Cold War, early days of the Cold War, and once after the Cold War.
And China has Pakistan available as a strategic hedge vis-a-vis India.
Yes, that's true. I mean, I don't deal with it much in the book because I say it's more effect than cause. I think because of the India-China enmity, Pakistan became a factor between them. I don't think it's a fundamental cause, and the book tries to look at these four fundamental Ps. Pakistan might have been the fifth P, but I would say you're right. I mean, it more enters into strategic partnerships for China. And the only thing I would say there, which I don't really say in the book, is that China's relationship with Pakistan is not only about balancing India or distracting India. There are other reasons why the Chinese want the Pakistanis on their side, and those have to do with the Gulf, with Afghanistan, the larger issue of China's entree to the Islamic world, and at one point, of course, nuclear secrets, where they were given, Dutch centrifuges in return for certain kinds of considerations as well. So that's the only, I think, rather more interesting point about the China-Pakistan relationship.
Okay, so for our viewers, I will list the four Ps in the order in which you've listed them, and then Aadil takes over. So P for power, that is the first P. Second is perception, that is the second P. Third is territorial parameters, that is the third P. And the fourth is partnerships. Aadil, your turn now, you take over.
Right. Thank you for writing this excellent book. I've learned a lot from the book. And as someone who was responsible for promoting India's soft power as a student, I have encountered that getting people to attend lectures on India is always tough as compared to something like China. So thank you for writing this excellent book, and I've learned a lot. My first question is, do you think that the soft power component of the competition between India and China is now in a flux, and there is like an opportunity for India to rise up on the soft power index, and China, and globally you've seen that China's own soft power ability has relatively gone down because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the views about China are highly negative at the moment. So do you think this COVID-19 pandemic offers an opportunity for India, and China has to sort of adjust its own strategy? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the book is a bit bald-faced and really says that China is ahead in the soft power game. Just to remind viewers, soft power is, I mean, it's a pretty slippery construct, but it's basically the power of getting others to do what you want them to do by the power of attraction, the power of persuasion. So it's not putting a gun to your head, either an economic gun to your head or a literal gun to your head, but it's persuading you to do what I want by being attractive to you and by power of persuasion. And I think I do say in the book that China scores. I use the Lowy Institute in Australia's various measures, which really focus on three things: foreign policy influence, cultural projection, and political values. And I think it's really on the first two that China scores. Now, I won't replay all of those, but to address your larger question of whether now there's a moment where India might strike back, as it were, in the soft power domain, partly because of COVID. And I think your suggestion is that, the Wuhan origins issue and so on, the discourse around China's hiding something about the data and so on. It's less than transparent posture at times, have certainly, brought a certain amount of disapprobation and disapproval of China. There's no doubt about that. But, if you look at some of the other data that's available on how people from other countries look at China, they also admire the way that China has internally subsequent to Wuhan, managed several lockdowns, rolled out the vaccines, even though their efficacy might not be fantastic. And they've, for such a big country, they score very low on the number of infections and fatalities. So I think the picture is quite mixed. I think up to a point, India did rather well, but this second wave really has left India quite damaged, I think, in public perceptions, rightly or wrongly. I mean, we can argue about, the origins of this, whether it was more or less inevitable government policies, but I think most on the ground, just kind of, instinctual kind of measures of what people think, let's say here in Southeast Asia, but also some polling data shows that India hasn't done well there in terms of how it's handled COVID. So, people don't look at India on COVID as being some kind of a leader, as being an attractive country. It seems to have not done a good job, whereas I think China is getting some and in China in relation to the West, would seem to make a terrible mess, at least until the vaccination drive of its handling of COVID. So China's economic recovery has also been credited to the way it has dealt with COVID. So I would say it's still a case that China scores quite well, even though people are annoyed with it about the original outbreak.
Yeah. Aadil, go ahead.
So the second question I wanted to ask is about the sort of modernity that China offers in terms of soft power that you talk about in your book. If you can talk about that modernity, what is that in terms of, going out to the world, selling their ideas and products to the world? Do you think that whole idea of modernity, the way China offers it, is still intact and it can continue to play a role in the global affair?
Yeah, I'm glad you sort of put it that way around the trope of modernity, because I think in a way the book does gesture towards it, but then fights shy of using that word. But I mean, I have some little episodes, personal ones, where on various trips to China, you engage this kind of modernity at many turns. I mean, I give examples of, for instance, going to some of the big cities, and of course, their gleaming towers and fabulous streets and all of that, which I suppose, is quite familiar to most viewers, but it still hits you, I think, when you go there, especially if you're an Indian, if you relate that to kind of Indian urban spaces. I mark also, there that you get the sense, of China is a very secular place. I mean, I don't mean to say that they don't have religious affiliations. We know they're becoming more religious, but the big cities at least give you that very clear sense of its business and business-like interactions between people. I mean, you won't see temples all over the place and religious processions and so on and so forth that our Indian urban spaces have. Now, I'm not, picking favorites, but I'm just saying that for a lot of people who look at the two, and let's say foreigners who want to study there or live there and work there, that's probably much closer to what they were used to, especially Westerners. They're used to these kind of very business-like secular spaces. There's an episode I have there. I went to Xi'an, where the great historical sites of are, and I tried to pay for some knickknacks that I bought with cash, and the lovely cherubic, twinkly-eyed Chinese woman there in that little janpat-like stall, she just waved my cash away. Then I pulled out my credit cards; those were waved away, and this is 3-4 years ago. And I thought, gosh, well, I'm here from Singapore, which is this rich, advanced country, and I don't seem to be getting anywhere with this woman. And all she would accept, and it struck me in those days, was WeChat and Alipay and so on, which now is standard. But at that point, I thought, gosh, well, things are moving very fast in China. I mean, those are just some vignettes of the kind of modernity that you encounter there, I think, which has its dark side. But it also has its very attractive side. And for soft power terms, when people look at it, a lot in the third world, they're a bit awestruck by where China has arrived.
Yeah. This show, Kanti, is not for the egghead. We have a large audience, a large number of subscribers. So expressions used in strategic community some of those need to be explained and specified. So you mentioned CNP, Comprehensive National Power. And you say in terms of CNP, Comprehensive National Power, China is 7 times India. So first of all, what does comprehensive national power mean? Tell somebody who does not have a PhD from Urbana Champaign or University of Toronto or someplace. And second, this gap is increasing or is India narrowing the gap?
Yeah, both very good questions. And thanks for the reminder that it's a very mixed audience and I shouldn't get too jargonish. But comprehensive national power has many avatars. The Japanese have their own, the Chinese have popularized it even more. But I use it really as the amalgam of hard power, which is economic power and military power, and then soft power, which is the third part that I just talked about. So if you add those up, then that gives you comprehensive national power. Now, since they are interactive, they tend to be synergistic, I say, because if you have hard power, that backs up your soft power. I don't think you can really have a lot of soft power unless you're in Norway, if you don't have economic heft and if you don't have a certain amount of awe-inspiring military power. But the reverse is true too. Soft power plays into hard power in the sense that, soft power can do a lot of work for you and conserve your hard power, your economic power and military power. If you can persuade people to do what you want, you don't have to exert your hard power, your economic and military power. So all I did was, I mapped the various types of indices, the measures of these 3 types of power. And we know, for instance, that China's GDP, total economic activity, is 5 times India's size today, probably a bit more. Looking at the Lowy instrument that I mentioned, which measures elements of soft power, I noted on an estimate that China's soft power was about 1.2 the size of India's. And I estimated just back of the envelope, I probably can't even explain to you quite how I arrived at that figure, but I said, China's effective military lead over India is 1.2:1. So then I multiplied those 3 across, 5 into 1.2 into 1.2, and I got 7.2. So I said, well, comprehensive national power is about 7 times India's. And, that's a very bald figure. It's just something to catch people's attention and to perhaps give us a sense of really how big the gap is. And you asked the second question, is it getting bigger or is it getting smaller? I think on soft power, I already indicated that India, all said and done, the gap may not be closing there. On military power, we could pursue that a bit further. It may not be the gap may not be growing too much, but it's not shrinking. But on the economics, let me just leave you with one thought, which is assume that both countries now grow at 6% per annum GDP. Given that India is at about $3 trillion GDP, just short of that, and given that China is at about 15 trillion right now, the gap is $12 trillion. At 6% growth rates for both countries, India has slowed down. I'm not sure that over the next 10 or 12 years, on average, we'll do much more than 6% per annum. I may be wrong. Years ago, Jairam Ramesh said we can never grow less than 7%. Sadly, of course, that's not quite been the case. But assume it's about 6%, and assume the Chinese also grow at about 6%. They might grow slightly slower, but it looks good at the moment. They will double, and we will double our GDP in 12 years. That's the formula. And that means the Chinese will go from $15 trillion GDP to 30 trillion, and India will go from 3 trillion to 6 trillion. The gap between us today is $12 trillion. In 12 years, it could be $24 trillion GDP gap. So it may turn out to be slightly smaller because India will grow slightly faster and China will grow slightly slower. But we're looking at a potentially huge gap.
What do you have any concern for the Chinese in terms of their demographics? Although India is catching up.
Yeah. So of course, we're going to pass the Chinese very soon. And by about 2050 or thereabouts, the gap could be 300 to 400 million people. in our favor. But then the question is, what's the quality of your population? They have to be literate, educated up to a point, skilled, healthy, able to carry out tasks. The demographic dividend oughtn't to become a demographic nightmare. Sadly, given our levels, even now, of illiteracy, variable quality of our tertiary education system in terms of colleges and universities, and even given our kind of skill-based vocational training, I think we're still quite a long way behind and will be behind the Chinese for quite some time to come. And one issue on health: 40% of the world's stunted people, 40% of Indians, have been stunted. Stunted is not just being short; it is the effect of malnutrition and ill health on cognitive abilities. Now, that's an enormous number of people whose cognitive abilities may have been impaired in childhood or early years. Those are abilities that we may not be able to correct for with education and as a person develops. So, these are some of the very troubling things that we have to think about, even though demography may work better for us.
I'll take one question from a subscriber who happens to be from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, your alma mater, partly a little bit. It's like somebody wearing a t-shirt saying, I went to Harvard. So a bit like that. At least I worked with Steve Cohen and I had a couple of publications. Kiran Ramnath from UIUC. Our strategic discourse vis-a-vis China isn't grounded in understanding of the Chinese cultural psyche of reverse colonizing to undo hurt and restore past glory. How should we study China to proactively predict and preempt future conflicts?
Yeah, I think that's a challenging question, but it's a very good one. In the book, in the perceptions chapter, I lay out these kind of three Chinese worldviews. And one of them, and I hope this addresses or gets towards the question that has been asked, is this kind of Tianxia worldview, which I think people are more and more familiar with. Tianxia basically means all under heaven. And it's a Confucian idea in a sense, which has been recovered by Chinese intellectuals and political circles in contemporary China. And essentially, in its operational version, not its philosophical version, is the tributary system. China is at the center of an enormous space, call it Asia or East Asia, ringed by a series of smaller countries. Many of them were sort of Sinicized in terms of importing Chinese culture and practices historically. They also raged against China periodically, like the Vietnamese and the Koreans particularly. And the Japanese, of course, exited the tributary system, if they were ever part of it, very soon. But these countries and more, there's a view that in China that they were tributaries and they could be tributaries again. Now, the benign part of that vision is that, the tributary system was voluntaristic. Overawed by, attracted to, the Chinese court, countries came and paid tribute. And often the Chinese emperor was more generous in giving back than in receiving. So most of the gifts were tended to be symbolic or relatively minor material ones. China gave legitimacy back to these rulers by sanctifying their rule and often by giving them access to their markets. And so there's an argument that, China's rise today, these ideas are coming back to the fore. And ideally, this is how China looks at the world. And peace and stability and conflict resolution, and I'll just end with this thought perhaps, will happen if everyone falls back into this kind of tributary system where China is kind of a benevolent hegemon and gives more than it receives, but does demand deference. And in today's strategic language, deference would be respect China's red lines on, let's say, Taiwan, on Hong Kong, on this or that, South China Sea. Don't challenge China and embarrass it in international or regional fora. And in return, you get you get the Belt and Road, you get aid, you get recognition and political support, particularly if the West tends to poke fingers at you. So China becomes a sort of political backstop for you internationally. So I suppose, if that's the way China really looks at the world, and there's some evidence clearly of that sort of view, then, that says something about how one must approach China and deal with it. We can reject that, as I think India certainly has. But there are countries in Southeast Asia, for instance, or elsewhere, even as far as Europe, who are quite attracted to a Chinese hegemony for the kinds of reasons I've laid out.
Aadil?
I just wanted to add something. You don't talk about popular culture in your book as much. China also has this giant soft power because of the popular culture. Things like Tencent and video games, which are made in China. And these video games are played all across the world. And people learn about Chinese culture because of these video games. And that's another aspect that I don't think experts or academics pay as much attention to, and they should. When they measure how China ranks on the soft power index. And I think that's something we should keep in mind.
Yeah, very much so. Actually, when I was writing it, I did make a foray into it. But it's quite a complex area. And I think in part you have to be, well, in the example you give, you have to be a bit of a techie, and I'm useless at that. I don't play games and I just don't connect to that lifestyle. But I do recognize it's very, very important. Especially for younger people. And so, they're the future. And how China evolves and how they look at China evolving could well be through that lens. I made some forays as well into, looking at the Chinese art market and comparing it to the Indian art market, looking at the spread of Chinese literary classics and so on. So Chinese classical culture, but more recent popular culture products. Chinese film, the great directors, contemporary directors, Yang Jimu and his movies, or Wong Kar-wai and people like that. Jackie Chan is a household word. We have some equivalents in India, but again, I think India pushes out an enormous volume. I'm not sure in the movie world, we're quite as well known or respected for the quality of contemporary films. It's just a guess, but and I wouldn't bet my life on it, but Chinese food. Chinese food has almost become, part of global food, really. People hardly think of it almost as Chinese. I don't think Indian food has quite got there, except maybe in Britain, where it's become a sort of, a British food. But, so, these are some hard truths. It's quite difficult for us as Indians to accept this, that, we don't rank quite as high as we think. And part of this is that China brings enormous money power behind it, technological power. Take CGTN, since we're on the media. We get it here. I watch it now and then. It's a slick production with very high production values. No Indian TV channel, I'm very sorry to say, and I watch NDTV regularly and a couple of others, they don't have those production values. I know the Chinese debate is very mannered and stylized and so on. But, it isn't a shouting match either. And it's not 20 screens all at the same time with people screaming at each other, including the anchors. So there's a kind of a rational debate. You can agree or disagree with it privately sitting in your home, but at least you can understand what's going on. Experts are allowed to speak without interruption. Of course, it's a slick propaganda, soft power product, but you have to admire the production values. I know in India, we've had discussions at the governmental level with the Congress government in the past and now with the BJP about setting up an Indian global television channel. But it hasn't happened. And the Chinese are scoring there, just to give you another example of the way that China is reaching out globally. So yeah, you're very right about Chinese popular culture. It's a hard one for me because I'm not a popular culture expert. I know we had a student at the LKY school in Indian. I don't know if you know him, Krish Raghav, and he's doing amazing work apparently on, Chinese popular culture, on music and sort of graphic novels and poetry and literature there. It's, when I was in Shanghai last, I went to art shows and all of that, and you get a very global feel in Shanghai, at least, and Beijing. So you're right to underline it. And I think, we in India, we have to think about soft power and how we can project that far better.
Aadil, you watch these Chinese channels in their native language as well. How do you rate them? Do they have debates?
Not as much as Indian TV, but definitely CGTN is getting good at sending out their messages. They want to emulate CNN model, and I think they're getting good at it year by year. And they might not have debate as open as Indian TV, but they are definitely good at the graphic part of it, as Dr. Bajpai mentioned, and the production quality has improved. And every year you can see that they're getting good at the narrative part of it. And now they're using YouTube and other platforms to send out their propaganda. So they keep getting better each year.
And they are using Twitter like hell, while they ban it in China.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Aadil, question?
I was just thinking about Chris Raghav and the work you were mentioning earlier. That's really impressive what he's doing. Along the similar lines, I wanted to talk about the diaspora. Indian and Chinese diaspora are all around the world. So let's think about how the diaspora in, let's say, US or Canada, when they come across another Chinese person, there is this dynamic between Indian and Chinese diaspora. How do you think that plays into the broader competition between India and China?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I haven't been in the West now for, at least a decade. So I'm probably a little bit behind, and it'd be interesting to get your thoughts. My instinct is, though, from all those years I lived there, is that, they both have their own place and their own kind of sort of power, I think, in Western countries and elsewhere. And certainly we know in North America, particularly in the United States, the Indian diaspora is by far the richest, I think, eclipsing even, the Jewish diaspora there, and Jewish Americans. So I don't think Chinese immigrants have quite that position. I think you see Indians a lot in professional life, particularly as business managers in the tech world, and of course, we know in California in technology and all of that. I think the Chinese, you'll see them enormously also in academic life, in some sectors of course of business life as well. Maybe more self-owning businesses perhaps than the Indians. Maybe quite small businesses. In some areas, of course, they overlap, and I think there's some material out there. I think perhaps the Carnegie Endowment's recent report shows that there are areas where they overlap as well and where they differentiate. I think Indians are much more visible in social causes, in political life in America. Likewise in Britain, I think. Likewise probably in Australia, whereas the Chinese are more likely to be in science, tech, medicine, and not so much in the public realm, although that may change. So I think these are some differences. I couldn't really speak to, how much they compete very ostensibly against each other. When India-China issues come up, or in social life. You probably can. You've been there more recently. I think on the whole, they probably are kind of two different worlds. They don't overlap that much, except in the workplace. They're not great friendships there and intermingling in the bars and restaurants and intermarriage. So it's not a very negative relationship. I wouldn't say it's a very warm and close one outside of in other parts of the world. But I mean, do give me a sense of it, but that's my sense of it.
Kanti, I have a question from Doon School. So let me get you a school question out of the way. So this is Aryan Prakash from the Doon School, who says, "Hi, Dr. Bajpai, being a former headmaster of the Doon School, what kind of impact do you think the pandemic has had on our education, especially for boarding schools?" This has nothing to do with China, India.
Yeah, I don't think China has too many boarding schools, although they have some international schools. And they do in the rural areas have these kind of boarding schools, I believe. But, well, I mean, obviously, I think my old school and other boarding schools have been hit pretty hard. And most of, I guess, students have been repatriated, as it were, sent home. So it's a real blow. I mean, notionally, the boarding school environment might actually be rather good, because it could be an escape from a city environment, a small town environment where COVID was raging. And because boarding schools are very controlled environments, with their walls, people aren't allowed in, and students can't get out much, you could actually control it very well. But, clearly, I mean, boarding schools might have limitations in terms of if they're in smaller towns or out there in the hills and things, in terms of medical facilities. If you do get an outbreak, you may not have the kind of internet facilities, that you perhaps need. And if an outbreak occurs, then, that same space that keeps things out now allows things to fester and infect very quickly within. So I think it is difficult. And what's the great value add of a boarding school? I mean, apart from the fact that parents who move around a lot, for them, it's great to send their kids to a place where, for 5 or 6 years, there's continuity of education. But the other great value add, and the most singular, is that, it's all there in a boarding school. Your hobbies, your social and community service facilities, your sport, your ability to show leadership by leading other boys and looking after them, or other students. You don't get as much of that in a day school, I think. And so that, if you're not able to stay in a boarding school, you're repatriated during COVID, then the real value out of a boarding school has just disappeared, frankly. So it's a difficult time for boarding schools, and I hope and pray they all get back to schools.
Yeah. Questions. I will take questions from 2 subscribers. They are different questions, but we can link them. Vijeta Jena says, is this China's effort to draw attention away from COVID, what they are doing on the border with us? And second, if that is Padmakshi, K. Padmakshi, if the Chinese elites look down upon India, how do they regard their own people, given the massive surveillance there at every level? How is the life of Chinese people? Is it better, worse?
Well, I mean, in terms of the first question, I don't think it has much to do with COVID, what happened in Ladakh. My own instinct is, I mean, it's still breaking news. We're too close to the events. But if I had to place a bet, again, I would say that probably the simplest explanation is the one that's staring us in the face, which is that it's something to do with the extension of Indian infrastructure and up to the Karakoram Pass and the DBO road. So the Chinese are uncomfortable with that. And I think behind that is, whenever you think India-China problems, think Tibet. That's my small kind of formula. And I think what this reveals is that even relatively modest Indian infrastructure development over the last 10 years or so, going back to the UPA government, has got the Chinese worried, because they're always worried, super worried about Tibet. And we're seeing signs of it even now. Some of the speeding up of re-education camps and things like that in Tibet, trying to get Tibetans in the countryside, out of the countryside, and so on and so forth. Some new, I think, legislation that's going through there about the role of language and such, which Aadil, I think, probably knows more about than me. So, I think behind Ladakh 2020 is the road, and behind that is Tibet. And just to nail the point home, I mean, there was a face-off in 2013 in Depsang, 2014 in Chumar, 2015 in Birdsey. These are all in the Ladakh sector. So it's not just COVID. I mean, Ladakh 2020 is, in a sense, the culmination. Okay, so I mean, if I had to place my bets, I would probably place it there. On the issue of how Chinese elites, they look down their noses at India, for sure. I mean, the book tries to show the kind of racist and very negative views that, I mean, quite a lot of Chinese elites and maybe more ordinary people have. In India, we have a lot of those views as well. But since the question is about China, so certainly, I mean, from the late 19th century, I think China's tended to look down on India as a kind of a dirty, crowded, chaotic place, a Luan place, as they say, chaotic, How do they look at their own people? I mean, I think very patronizingly, and they don't trust their own people. And I think the great worry of China is always, or the Chinese elite and rulers, is that every now and then China has an internal convulsion of some kind, leading to almost a collapse. And I think this haunts them. I mean, look at the way Xi Jinping has collapsed the open space that existed before he came, partly because he studied what happened in the collapse of the Soviet Union and basically said, never, not that. We don't want that. We've got to make sure that that never happens. And the reading there is that they lost control. And this is the nightmare, I think, of Xi Jinping and the people around him and the elites, is that, there could be a convulsion. And, I end the book by saying that for all of China's lead and its growing power and the way it now sort of almost stands toe-to-toe with the Americans, there's a lot, you can sense there's a great unease. Why otherwise is Xi Jinping so autocratic, so centralizing? Why did he vote himself, into power in perpetuity? He knows something about China that is making him uneasy that perhaps we don't know enough about. But my inference is you don't need all that control and centralization unless you're deeply worried. You might say that it's because he's really trying to discipline the Chinese people in the competition against the Americans. But they're already getting there in terms of evening up the playing field with the Americans. I suspect that a good bit of the worry for Xi Jinping is that he doesn't trust his own people, he doesn't trust his own society, and maybe at the end of the day, he doesn't even quite trust the system he has, and so he has to batten down the hatches even more.
Aadil?
Excellent points. My last question that I'm interested in finding from you is, do you think Indians are making an effort to learn about China? I've seen that there is increased amount of interest in learning about China, what goes on in China. If you look at the webinars, the lectures that are organized nowadays, even in Indian media, there's such a huge discussion about China. Do you think Indians are making an honest effort to learn about China for the first time in our modern history?
That's also a subscriber question from Bhavik Gandhi of ASCO Capital, who says, does India lack a strategic culture to predict activities of China in Pakistan? Are we unable to second guess adversaries? Obviously, because we don't study them enough.
Yeah, I would certainly say that that's true. And, you mentioned Steve Cohen, Shekhar, who was a kind of mentor to both of us, certainly to me academically. And he always made that point about the lack of expertise. It's so striking that if we just move away from China for a moment, how many Pakistan experts do we have, apart from the great ambassadors we've had who've served in Pakistan and diplomats? How many real, dependable, thoughtful, knowledgeable Pakistan watchers do we have in India? And likewise, we've fallen on very bad times on China watching, at least until very recently. The first generation of academic China watchers, and again, leave aside the diplomats, they've come and gone, the Giri Deshinkars and so on, Meera Sinha Bhattacharya and all those people. And we didn't really replace them quickly enough and sufficiently enough. So, we've got language programs. Delhi University has a China program. JNU has an East Asia program with an active China program. But for 1.4 billion people, it's just not enough. But I think you're right. Indian elites are waking up. And let me just tick off a few points. My book, of course, has just come out, but Anand Krishnan's book just very recently. Before that, Zorawar Daulat Singh's book. I know there's a couple of very prominent Indian diplomats. I won't mention their names because they probably may not want me to, but there are at least two more very good books coming out on China from them. I think we're going to get several other books, some that I probably missed. Ashoka University has set up a China postdoctoral fellowship program now, which I'm also somewhat involved in, but Shankar Menon is helming that. So there's an Institute of Chinese Studies, which has a long history here, of course. And virtually every Indian think tank now, as Aadil said, has discussions on China virtually every day. So I think, and the media, a lot of the stuff in the media is pretty terrible, but at least there's stuff there now, and increasing Twitter and other commentary. So I'm optimistic. I'm really looking forward to this. And if my book plays a small role in trying to excite people on China, India-China relations and China per se, then I think, I'll be very, very satisfied. I think on India's strategic culture, so this is part of a strategic culture, the institutional wherewithal, the bricks and mortar, and then there's the thought process. And there, I guess I would say, and I've done in my other writings, that we do have 2 or 3 rather prominent schools of strategic thinking. And, I could say something about that, but very broadly, just very quickly, there's still a kind of a Nehruvian school. And you can probably fill in the blanks on what that means. And then there's a very realist school, which one could trace back all the way to Kautilya and all of that. But in its modern variant, there are people who really believe that, you have to be a great power. You have to will yourself into being a great power and make all the kind of sacrifices and changes you need to become that if you want to prevail with anyone, including with China. You have to speak from a position of great strength. It's that point of view. And in between is a kind of what I call a neoliberal viewpoint, which is, the very realist people have probably got it wrong in the sense that you first got to fix the economy. It's the economy, stupid. Once you've got a humming, burgeoning economy and a technological sector and so on, then, you can invest in the military, but don't do it prematurely. Otherwise, you'll choke off the goose that lays the golden egg, which is the economy. And I think that was Deng Xiaoping, in a sense, if I had to get a counterpart, which was hide and bide. Don't alienate the Americans and the powers that be until you've grown your own power. And so that's the third school. And I think there's still a debate on between these 3 schools in India. And I think they all have some merit. And, I think people will take sides, of course.
Aadil Brar is also among those scholars, young scholars on China. Aadil, you live in Toronto, but right now you're in Punjab. Whereabouts are you?
I am in Bathinda, Punjab.
I see.
That's where my family is from.
So I went to school in class 6 in Bathinda. That should please you.
Oh, that's impressive. I did not know that.
Yeah, a school called MSD Public School. It's still there.
It's still there. My father went there as well.
Okay. Maybe your father was somewhere there around same time as I. But the playground now has a big statue of Hanumanji.
Yes, it's still there. That's where the Ram Leela happens every year.
That's right. So there is Aadil. You talked about the economy, Kanti. A.V. Gopalakrishnan wants to know he's a lawyer in Bombay. How is China's economy still growing in spite of the pandemic? How did they beat the pandemic like this?
Well, I'm not an economist, obviously, but I'll do my best. I think obviously controlling the pandemic itself was part of the reason they've grown at about 3 to 4%, I guess, or a bit more. I think the second answer is that, they have this idea of the, kind of the circular economy or whatever they call it, which is that, in the internal market, as I understand it, basically is what they have to now cultivate far more. So it was a classical East Asian economy, export-led growth. You export your way to growth, which India never managed to do, unfortunately. The Chinese did it, like the Japanese and the Asian tigers and so on did before them. And so I think, in this phase, China has tried to do that. And the third thing is, of course, in 2008, they did it. And since then, and even now, I think they poured liquidity into the system. So, you stimulate the economy by pouring finance into it and allowing economic growth to go that way. And of course, they're still the workshop of the world. So they're still exporting rather nicely. And demand may have dropped off amongst their clients, but it hasn't dropped off completely. So, they're exporting everything. Every day I order something on, one of the local web platforms here, Lazada or Shopee or some such. And virtually every single product I get is made in China. It's quite astonishing. And so, there's external demand still for their products. So I would say, out of all of that, they're doing quite nicely. Thank you. And this is why I say, I think they're in still pretty good shape to grow at 6% or more for a good long time. There's the domestic demand that will grow and that they will. Now, there are problems, obviously. Some of the liquidity they're pumping into the system is being badly used. there are problems with SOEs. We know there's an enormous problem in both the shadow banking and the main banking sectors, and these may come home to roost. But they haven't yet. And, every couple of years we hear that it's all going to explode in China, and then it never quite does. So, but yeah, I mean, I think those are worries for China. And the question still is, will China exit the middle income kind of trap or limitation and really boom into a high income stratum? And I think that's still a bit of an open question. We talked about technology earlier. Watch the technology space. I mean, the only thing that will get you out of the middle income trap, and India is not there yet, is technology. And the Chinese are making great strides there. Although, just to plug the book again for a minute, in the US-China competition, my instinct is that, it's been a bit oversold that the Chinese have overtaken the Americans and all of that. So if you do have the book, in the final chapter, I do an estimate of that, and just using other people's work. But but watch technology. That's where China in the end will, if it's really going to sustain its growth. And this takes me back to one final point, which is the demography. I mean, if your population is going to age so dramatically as it seems it's going to in China, then how do you compensate? You can only compensate by injecting technology into the system to keep productivity and value addition high. And so the Chinese are working very hard on that.
Or allowing immigration, which they will not allow.
Yeah, so that's the other. And that's where the West scores. That's where the Americans will keep scoring. I think the Chinese certainly are not there yet. I don't know what the numbers of expats are in China, but it wouldn't be very large.
Yeah. You mentioned SOEs. So for our Indian audiences, SOEs in China is what is PSUs in India. So
Correct.
Public sector undertakings in India. In China, these are state-owned enterprises. So,
Sorry about that. Yeah.
so I'm just Indianizing this.
Right.
Since you talked about technology, Nanima Basu, who's our diplomatic editor, she says, how much of an impact will US-China competition have on India's foreign policy? In this aspect, do you think the battleground in technology, that is 5G, blockchain, are already set?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a very big possibility. I mean, we are already seeing, decoupling, obviously, on the American part in some areas. I think Biden may slow it down somewhat. That's just my instinct. For instance, he's seemingly reaching out to some of the big Chinese telecom companies again, and I think TikTok has been allowed back in or some such, and he may make peace with Huawei eventually, it strikes me. But certainly the Americans will still decouple, and so that means that there'll be that kind of elephant in the room between the Chinese and the Americans constantly, and a difference between them, and an area of competition. I mean, I'd love to say that India could exploit that space, and its high-tech companies could jump in and take over some American business and begin to supply America. But I can't think very quickly offhand. I mean, it's not exactly my area, but can't think of an Indian brand that is quite there in terms of supplying some very well-known high-tech stuff that we could jump in there with. So I'm not sure we'll profit a great deal from it. We'll profit from the fallout, the diplomatic fallout, which is what Naomi might be pointing to, which is that, there's a kind of alienation of the Americans from the Chinese, which seems to be quite structural now over technology. The fact that the Chinese steal it or get hold of it in other kinds of ways and don't respect IPR. The Americans obviously are very upset about that. And so to that extent, I mean, it'll keep the Americans alienated from the Chinese, because the worst thing that could happen for India, I suppose, when India is so far behind China, is that we lose a kind of external balancer, which is the United States, excuse me, against China. And so if there was a kind of softening of the American stance towards China, and it's happened. It nearly happened in 62, 63, just after the war between China and India, when the Kennedy administration began to soften towards the Chinese already. And it was stopped by Kennedy's assassination and left to then Johnson and then later Kissinger and Nixon to do it. But, we could get a surprise if they dramatically do a deal of some kind. And, the Chinese and the Americans have done deals before. So I think the technology issue is the one thing that really might keep them well apart. And if that's the case, then I think, in a way, that's a positive for India. But I don't see, India being able to exploit it economically very much. So, beyond that, I don't know. My train of thought, I think, doesn't extend much further on that issue. But I think, we've got to also remember that much as, we want good stuff happening between India and the United States, there's always been an Indian reluctance to become a kind of partner in a very strong alliance-like or strategic partnership. And that comes out of Indian culture, out of Indian history, post-colonial history, colonial history. It comes out of, some racial discomfort, in a sense, if you like, with Americans as Westerners, and so on and so forth. And it comes from maybe a strategic perspective, which is, hey, why not use the space between two contending powers rather than pitch with one against the other? You could say non-alignment was that thing, where you exploited the space between the Soviet Union and the Americans. Years ago, a foreign economist said that India milks two cows between, the United States and Soviet Union. Could do it between China and the US as well. There's kind of an Indian limit in terms of how far it'll go. And I think that also sets limits to the India-US relationship. It's a bit of a cultural, political culture, strategic culture issue that stops us.
Well, we are coming to an end to this. Aadil, you want to ask the last question before we close?
If you have to phrase it in one sentence, why do you think India and China are not friends?
Having put my 4 Ps out there, and you can see I'm trying to buy time here. I would say at the end of it, I'll plump for the 4th P, which is power, which fourth in the book, first in my priority list here. And the reason for that, I think, is this, that China feels it's so powerful, it doesn't feel the need today to make any concessions to India. And India, conscious of its weakness vis-a-vis China, doesn't feel that it can accommodate the Chinese for fear of being seen to surrender to China. Yeah. So, the structural issue of the power difference, it's not just that it's irksome and makes us feel bad or, and looks bad, but it's that it has psychological consequences and diplomatic consequences on both sides. The Chinese don't see why they should concede, and the Indians don't see how they can accommodate without looking weak.
Yeah, so friendship has to be there between equals.
At least more equals, for sure. We need to close the gap.
Or like China-Pakistan, which is shared interest, with one being sort of, as you said, a tributary of the other, and we know who's the tributary of who. Yeah. So we come to an end of this, come to the end of this session. Unfortunately, we can't go on. I have a lot of questions from our subscribers. We may even mail some to you, Kanti, and if you have time, you can just record audios or videos and we will publish them. Professor Hitendu Dave at University Children's Hospital Zurich, who doesn't quite agree with you that the Chinese soft power is greater than India's. There is Jay Shatila, who wants to know that considering India didn't do well in the Industrial Revolution era or on the innovation front, hence no Amazon, Facebook, Google, do you think India stands any chance of becoming a decent country, or not even a decent? He means a prominent country, not even a world leader in the coming decade. Then Neeraj Sharma from Arunachal Pradesh Power Corporation. What is it that the two countries need to do to win each other's trust? There are many more, but I think I'll stop here and we'll send you some questions. And thank you very much. And thank you, Aadil, for being there and asking marvelous questions. Kanti was worried. He said that he's done a lot of interviews and will we have new interesting stuff coming out. You watch how well this is received.
Thank you, Shekhar. Thanks, Aadil. Happy to do it.
Thanks for the discussion.